Hello and welcome to episode 20 of the Absid History Podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past, and another instalment of a 12-part series entitled A Spring of Classical Arabic Poetry with Dr. Kevin Blankinship at Brigham Young University in Utah, Part 2, al-Farazdaq, 641 to 730 Common Era and his rivals, an introduction to Umayyad poetry. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at School of Oriental African Studies in London. Now on to the show. Born around 641 Common Era, Hammam bin Ghalib, better known as al-Farazdaq, would become distinguished as one of the greatest of classical Arab poets, devoting much of his talents to satirizing rival tribes, indulging in amorous verse, and frequently on the run. To discuss with me the life, work, and legacy of al-Farazdaq is Dr. Kevin Blankinship. Welcome, Dr. Blankinship.
Hi, Talha. Good to be with you.
Farazdaq lived in the turbulent times of the early Umayyad Caliphate. What do we know about his socio-political and cultural context?
He lived between the period of 640 and 728 Common Era, which, as you mentioned, was marked by turbulence and transition. It was a period that saw the assassination of three caliphs, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the so-called First and Second Fitnas, sweeping conquests of territory and peoples in the Sasanian Empire in the east and the Byzantine Empire in the west, the Battle of Siffin in 657, and the somewhat ambiguous arbitration that weakened Ali's position, leading ultimately to his murder in 661, and the accession of Muawiyah and the Umayyad dynasty. All of this contributed to political and social instability that forced poets like al-Farazdaq to move from patron to patron and to be resourceful about where they would get their next meal. In terms of literature and culture, there was a transition from a primarily rural desert society to an urban one. There were also major reforms under the Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, which included introducing a single Islamic currency in place of Byzantine and Sasanian coinage, establishing Arabic as the language of bureaucracy rather than Greek in Syria or Persian in Iraq. He also famously built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and had it inscribed with proclamations of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, in order to assert a distinctly Islamic character to the expanding empire, which was taking in more and more non-Muslims, and in the face of rival claimants to Muslim rule. There's a historical irony in the Umayyad assertion of Islam, since the Banu Umayyah were leaders in the Qurayshi opposition to Islam at the outset, only adopting it toward the end of the Prophet Muhammad's life. In literature, there was experimentation with new genres that grew out of pre- and early Islamic genres. One important development here to mention is the outgrowth of two traditions of love poetry. The first is known in Arabic as Udri love poetry, named after the name of the tribe, Banu Udra, which its important figures hailed from, especially Jamil Buthaina. There's another key figure, Kuthayr Azza, who hailed from the tribe of Azd. This was the chaste tradition of love poetry, in which there's a kind of virtuous distance between the poet and his beloved. We can contrast this with what's known in Arabic as Umari love poetry, so-called after Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, whose poetry is decidedly not chaste, and which is noteworthy for kind of dramatic dialogue where both the poet and his beloved address each other directly, in contrast to the sort of monologic voice of pre-Islamic poets crying out for a beloved who's no longer present. So these two traditions of love poetry, Udri and Umari, grew out of themes and motifs present in pre-Islamic poetry and became their own genres. And this signals an overall trend during this time period of al-Farazdaq's life of innovating and experimenting, in which poets drew from the tradition and then added to it based on the needs of their time. And this is something that we see in al-Farazdaq's work as well.
He was apparently cautioned in his adolescence by the fourth Sunni Caliph, or the first Shia Imam, Ali ibn Abi Talib, for his indulgence in poetry at the expense of focusing on Quran studies. What do we know about Farazdaq's colourful life?
His given name is Hammam ibn Ghalib, as you said, And his nickname al-Farazdaq is supposedly a Persian word meaning lump of dough, which was said to resemble his pasty, round face. He was born around 640 or 641 Common Era into a prominent and wealthy family of camel breeders in Basra. He belonged to the subtribe Mujashir ibn Darim, which is a subtribe of Tamim. And his mother was descended from Dabba, which was another powerful North Arabian tribe. So because of this ancestry, while he was young, he gained a reputation for being a partisan of the northern Arab tribes of Mudar. This was due in part to his family ancestry, as I mentioned, but also his mutual lampooning with the tribes of Fuqaim and Nahshal in a dispute over a well. So when his father introduced him to the Caliph Ali after the Battle of the Camel, he presented him as one of the northern Arab poets of Mudar. And as you mentioned, Ali was unimpressed and he advised Ghalib to teach his son Hammam the Quran, whereupon al-Farazdaq supposedly chained himself, vowing not to break his bonds before he had memorized the holy book. Throughout his career, al-Farazdaq would regularly boast of the superiority of northerners and lampoon southerners, which indicates sort of a broader overall conflict between these two groups, which is important to understand the dynamic of this period. However, it's important not to see al-Farazdaq or any poet hemmed in by what appear at first to be straightforward loyalties of tribe or ideology or audience. In al-Farazdaq's case, sometimes he would praise Arabs of Yemeni descent and their tribes and satirize northerners and their tribes as he saw fit on personal and moral grounds. Hence his famous poetic duels, which we'll talk about soon, with Jarir ibn Atiyah, who was a fellow member of the Tamim tribe of the Banu Kulayb ibn Yarbu' clan, and which poetic duels lasted for about 40 years and were hugely popular. And we'll talk about these more later. Otherwise, al-Farazdaq made a name for himself as a praise poet to the Umayyads. He praised Bishr ibn Marwan, the governor of Iraq, and his successor, the infamous al-Hajjaj, as well as many of al-Hajjaj's generals and underlings. He praised the Caliph Abd al-Malik only as part of his poems praising al-Hajjaj, but he did compose some poems dedicated specifically to Abd al-Malik's son al-Walid. And he was on closest terms, according to tradition, with the Caliph Sulayman, and like most other poets, didn't get much favor from Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who as a caliph had a reputation for austerity and therefore not lavishing gifts on poets. It was during the anti-caliphate of Abdullah ibn Zubayr that al-Farazdaq took advantage of his role as the guardian of his cousin Nawar to marry her to himself against her will. And this was his most important and tumultuous relationship with a woman. He was reportedly very promiscuous and married at least 3 other women. After bearing him 5 children, only one of whom, Labata, survived, Nawar eventually persuaded him to divorce her, an action which he deeply regretted, and not least because it was the subject of invective from his rivals, above all Jarir. During the caliphate of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, al-Farazdaq was incarcerated for a time, allegedly for having criticized a canal constructed by Khalid al-Qasri, who was the new governor of Iraq, and whom the poet disliked for his support of the southern Arab tribes. While in prison, al-Farazdaq wrote several odes trying to get himself freed, and these odes were addressed to the Caliph Hisham as well as to the head of the Basra police. And in these poems, he sought to acquit himself and argued why that should be. It's not clear how long he was in jail, but eventually he was released after the caliph intervened, and he died just a few years later.
His diwan contains several thousand verses of panegyrics, satire, and laments. Some are also vividly obscene. Tell us more about his works.
Like the political and socio-cultural milieu in which he found himself, al-Farazdaq and with him Jarir and al-Akhtal were transitional figures in Arabic literature. Ibn Rashiq al-Qayrawani captures this sentiment in his book Al-Umda when he describes them and says, Jarir and al-Farazdaq and al-Akhtal were once considered modern poets, muhdathin, but they came to be called old by us after their era had passed. So these poets, al-Farazdaq among them, relied on pre-Islamic motifs and engaged in tribal boasts. But on the other hand, al-Farazdaq, in his role as a eulogist, praised Umayyad rule as divinely appointed, which is a novel feature of the Islamic era. Most of al-Farazdaq's poems are satires or praise poems, although he does have elegies for the dead and some love poetry. He goes in especially for tribal boasting, but self-praise is less common. Over 7,000 lines have been preserved. The amatory theme is not so well developed, and he often omits the nasib, the amatory prelude of traditional pre-Islamic poetry. And later critics and scholars admire his praise and invective poetry for rich and sometimes rugged diction. And aside from being a praise poet to the Umayyads, al-Farazdaq was famous for his 40-year rivalry with Jarir and the Christian poet Ghiyath ibn Ghawth al-Akhtal al-Taghlibi, who took Jarir's side. Again, note that Jarir, who was a fellow member of Tamim and al-Akhtal of the Taghlib tribe, which took its ancestry from Adnan, the northern Arabs, were the subject of lampoon by al-Farazdaq, who had a reputation as a partisan of the northern Arabs. So, things weren't as clear-cut as they sometimes seem. This rivalry took the form of duels, in which Jarir and al-Farazdaq exchanged what are known as naqa'id, from the verb naqada, to destroy, undo, rebut. Poetic dueling in which tribal or personal insults are exchanged in poems, usually in pairs, employing the same meter and rhyme. Some of these poems are short and focus on just one theme, but in large part they took the form of multi-themed qasidas using pre-Islamic conventions. And these would often be performed in public, whether in front of large crowds at the Mirbad market of Basra or in more private salons held by rulers. And the former especially drew large crowds around either combatant's corner, and they would cheer him on. We can think of rap battles today with each performer sort of in his own corner, hurling epithets at the other person with a crowd of admirers surrounding him. These naqa'id can seem contradictory to modern readers who expect exemplars of good language and literature, which the naqa'id were taken to be of a certain high-minded register. As you mentioned, Talha, these poetic slanging matches can get very obscene, particularly since they resort to what was and still is the most popular way to insult a man in Arab society, which is to question the chastity or sexual mores of his female relatives, especially his mother and his sister. But on the other hand, these naqa'id poems became models of poetic style, and their vocabulary became fodder for grammarians and lexicographers. They're as rich in political and historical allusions as they are in humorous descriptions and gross exaggerations. And even their most obscene passages appear in standard recensions, which have been edited and printed even down to modern times. When it comes to preserving, transmitting, and quoting obscene poetry, it's interesting that modern scholars and philologists have often been primer and more proper than pre-modern Arab scholars and literateurs. But here it might be understandable why some Baudelarized versions exist, and they do, since the poetry can get quite vulgar. I'll give a very brief example about something that supposedly happened to someone related to Hammam. So a woman waking up her daughter called Vamya found that a snake had crept into her clothes. She cried for help, and Hammam, who happened to be nearby, chased the snake away by throwing some dust at it. And the snake had probably been attracted by the warmth of the girl's body. And Hammam found himself attracted to the girl's body in turn, and he touched the girl and kissed her, but she resisted. And when her relatives heard this, they were angry. One of them, called Amr ibn Murrah, was sent to play a trick on Hammam's sister Jarthan. So Amr waited for her and approached her when she one night left her tent to go to the bathroom. He put his hands on her hip and her leg and dragged her out of the tent, and she cried out, and some of her tribe's people hastened to the scene. This is apparently all that happened according to the Akhbar tradition. No one was raped or killed, but this became the subject of vehement insult against Hammam, this incident with his sister, and it was blown up into all kinds of pretty disgusting ways in poetry, with the intent of mocking al-Farazdaq. And I'll read just a very brief and relatively tame example, a line from from Jarir on this incident, which in Arabic says, بات ابن مرة قد علمت يهزها غمز الطبيب مكان العظم الفائق. All night, Ibn Murrah, as you know, shook her, probing her as a doctor probes the vertebra of the neck. Again, there are much more graphic examples on this incident. So later examples of naqa'id are of this genre of naqa'id exchange between poets are Naqa'id ibn al-Mu'taz wa Tamib ibn al-Mu'azz, and in the Mamluk era between Ibn Nubata al-Misri and Shams ad-Din al-Muhammad al-Khayyat, known as ad-Dufda', the frog. And they had satirical exchanges, and according to Salah ad-Din al-Safadi, were the Jarir and Farazdaq of the age.
Farazdaq passes away around 730 Common Era, nearly 90 years of age. Despite his career supporting the Umayyad caliphs, he's often seen as a Shia poet too. What has been his impact and reputation through the ages, and where can listeners turn next to learn more about him?
The question of who is the best poet, Jarir, al-Farazdaq, or al-Akhtal, is a widespread topic in Arabic works on poetry, which have many anecdotes and sayings on this matter. And for more on this, I'd recommend an article by Peter Smore in the Journal of Arabic Literature called Al-Farazdaq's Reception by Contemporaries and Later Generations. But just to give one or two quick examples, there's a famous saying attributed to Al-Akhtal when he was asked by Bishr ibn Marwan, the governor of Iraq, to judge between Jarir and Al-Farazdaq. He supposedly said, وجدت جريرا يغرف من بحر ووجدت الفرزدق ينحت من صخر. I have found that Jarir scoops from the sea, and I have found that al-Farazdaq carves out of stone, referring to the proverbial smoothness and lightness of Jarir's diction versus the kind of hard, rugged style of al-Farazdaq. Another poet, though, al-Buhtari, apparently preferred al-Farazdaq, and his opinion is preserved in Kitab as-Sana'atain by Abu Hilal al-Askari. And al-Askari relates that al-Buhtari preferred al-Farazdaq's poetry to that of Jarir, and he thought that al-Farazdaq had a command of poetic themes which Jarir could not equal. Each qasida of al-Farazdaq's poetry shows a new variation of whatever theme he's chosen, whereas Jarir tends to be repetitive, as when he retails over and over his opinion concerning Zubair, Ji'than, and Nawar, these people who were involved in al-Farazdaq's life. Meanwhile, yet another poet, Bashar ibn Burd, preferred Jarir on the grounds that he was more proficient with different kinds of poetry than al-Farazdaq, that al-Farazdaq hadn't mastered. So Ibn Salam discusses this in his Tabaqat al-Shu'ara. And he says, I asked Bashar al-Mura'ath, which of the three, Bashar ibn Burd, al-Akhtal, Jarir, or al-Farazdaq was the best poet, and he answered that al-Akhtal was not in the same league with the other two, even though the Rabi'a tribe were unaccountably fanatic in giving him their support. I then asked, what about the other two? Bashar replied, Jarir was good with different kinds of poetry that al-Farazdaq hadn't really mastered. For example, dirges and lamentations. When Nawar died, people bewailed her death with Jarir's dirges. So al-Farazdaq's, again, this is a common trope in later works of Arabic literary criticism, talking about these two and which is better. Al-Farazdaq's reputation for alid leanings, which you mentioned, rests on a poem that he gave in Mecca in praise of Ali ibn Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, better known as Zayn al-Abidin. The story goes like this. The crown prince Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik went on the pilgrimage during the reign of his father, Abd al-Malik, and after circumambulating the Kaaba, he tried to approach the Black Stone but couldn't because there were so many people crowding around it. Then a man came and performed circumambulation and went to the Black Stone, and all the people parted for him so he could reach it. Someone asked Hisham who the man was, and Hisham replied that he didn't know. And al-Farazdaq was there and overheard him, and he said, I know who this is, and then recited a poem that begins like this. This is he whose tread the flat ground knows, and the house of worship, the land beyond it, and the land within. This is the son of the best of all those who serve God. This is the pious, the God-fearing, the pure, the outstanding. It's also said that his father, Ghalib, Farazdaq's father, is said to have played some part in the Basra area in the conflict between Ali and Muawiyah. In considering any poet, including al-Farazdaq, it's important to keep in mind that they wrote for more than one audience and that sometimes the needs of audiences didn't overlap, which is why we might find sort of tensions or what seemed like conflicting loyalties or ideologies or emphases. Just to give listeners one or two other sources to go to for more information. One, which is an Arabic study from 2008, is by Hind bint Abd al-Razzaq, called An-Nafi fi Naqa'id Jarir wal-Farazdaq. So negation in the Naqa'id of Jarir and Farazdaq. It's a very good study. And then an article by Geert-Jan van Gelder called Sexual Violence in Verse, the case of Ja'athan al-Farazdaq's sister.
Finally, let's end with a sample and translation from the work of al-Farazdaq, our subject for today on the Abbasid History podcast.
The poem that I've brought today is a poem supposedly written at the end of al-Farazdaq's life. As I mentioned, he spent 40 years as a praise poet to the Umayyads, but also insulting Jarir and al-Akhtal and others who he considered worthy of his insult. At the end of his life, supposedly, he wrote a poem addressed to the devil, Iblis, repenting of his life spent lampooning and insulting other people. There's a question here of sincerity. According to the Khabar tradition, al-Farazdaq was approached one day in the market by a person who offered him a case of clarified fat, in exchange for which he asked al-Farazdaq to stop lampooning his tribe. So was al-Farazdaq in fact penitent, or did he do this just so he could get a nice bag of clarified fat and get this person off his back? It's unclear, and adds something to the argument in the Quran that poets are those who say that which they do not do. But in any case, I wanted to read a little bit from this poem addressed to Iblis, and which could be read as an insult poem, but rather than an insult poem to an enemy tribe or an enemy interlocutor, it's an insult poem to Iblis. First line is, in Arabic, إذا شئت حاجتني ديار محيلة ومربط أفلاء أمام خيامي. It would be easy for fleeting abodes in the place before a campsite where newborn colts were tethered to stir my longing. You would find ad-daw and al-hamd reddening my eyes with tears, for nothing is left of these except the raised side of a wall leveled to the ground, and 3 hearthstones to which ashes cling like a she-camel to her calves. Don't you see? I swore to my Lord, standing between a locked door and a standing rock, that I would never slander any Muslim, nor that unkind words would leave my mouth. Don't you see? Between poetry and me, Islam has sprung up like furrowed mountain slopes vying for rain. In those furrows has the compassionate cured my ailing breast, and from the dark their light dispersed the blindness of my eye. Iblis, I obeyed you for 70 years, and when my head had gone gray and my end drew near, I fled to my Lord, certain that I would in due time meet my death. And when what I feared drew close, and that fated meeting approached, I swore to struggle with my soul, be its virtues and vices as they may. Long did I let the devil, father of jinn, drag along my camel without reins. He enticed me to travel as I leaned on my thighs. At times he lagged, other times he walked in front. He gave me glad tidings that I would never die, that I would live forever in a garden, in peace. I asked him, did your arm draw your younger brother, Pharaoh, back from the depths of the stormy seas? You tossed him to the sea like mass of rock, fixed to Yathbul and Shamam. But when the waves closed around him, you turned your back and gave him no means of escape. Did you also not come to the people of Al-Hijr as they savored matchless luxury, lounging in mansions of marble? You said, slay this pregnant camel, halt it and make it kneel, for it will be your ruin. But when they halted the camel to cut off its hocks, you claimed innocence and turned your back. Likewise, Adam and his spouse cast out when they lived in the best of abodes. You swore a faultless oath, Iblis, that you were only giving good counsel. So they set out, tying leaves to cover themselves after eating the vilest of fruits. How many have served you, and now all that's left of them are stories, even though they used to luxuriate under the shade of clouds. Iblis, I don't need you anymore to lead me by the reins. I will repay you for all the wrong you did and to which you drove me. With piercing wounds, you will rail against them in hellfire, that flame which engulfs with kindling ablaze in the fruit of Zaqqum. Indeed, Iblis and his son have gorged every person on punishment. The two of them spat into my mouth, but I will saddle a heap of stones onto the baying, yelping cur.
Dr. Blankinship, thank you.
Thank you, Talha.